So Michael Phillips, thank you for joining us. And here we go with the 5 tenets of the holistic orchard.
Well, I'm glad to be here. And right off the bat, I'm going to tell you that it's really comfortable to be with Alaskan growers, because often this time of year, I'll talk to like southeastern growers and peaches are blooming down in North Carolina. And when I talk to you all, it's like, I know you're looking at snow just like I'm looking at snow, and we're all facing the pruning season, and I don't feel behind. So we're going to jump into the slideshow. I'm going to kind of give a big overview of this idea of holistic orcharding. And I have 5 specific tenets, but you're going to see that things really overlap. This is all about where does health come from in terms of the tree, of the quality of the fruit that we grow, the way that we as human beings have a role as stewards. Yeah, you'll see. So as we get into this, I just want to start with that notion of, what does this word holistic mean? So the counter to that would be allopathic. So in allopathic medicine, allopathic agriculture, I'm not using the words chemical or organic. I'm just saying allopathic choices are ones where we try to alter a symptom by either a toxic measure, cutting it out, what have you. And a holistic measure is one whereby we work to support the health of the system. So that, in the case of the orchards, we're going to be talking about soil biology. We're going to be talking about arboreal biology. We're going to be talking about nutrients, balanced nutrition. Going to be talking about diversity and the role that other plants play in the orchard ecosystem, both above and below the ground. It all gets very, very cool, but let's just have that construct of what holistic means. This is actually quite an interesting picture. I chose it. This dates back to about the year 1934. And in that picture, the 2 guys who are not wearing any kind of protection, and I love the trident wands, they're spraying lead arsenate. And the horse doesn't have a mask on either. And in that year alone, 40 million tons of lead arsenate were put onto the North American continent in the name of agriculture. So you can get the sense that we really kind of went into not necessarily the right place for quite a long time. So these 5 tenets, and I'm going to get into each one separately, but just as an overview, we're going to be talking about the fungal piece. That's definitely going to include the mycorrhizal fungi. Things like fungal foods will come into that, inoculating tree root systems. We're going to be talking about mineralization, which is kind of at the heart of photosynthesis, and that's what trees do. We're thinking about the fruit growing part, but we're going to really recognize what's going on in terms of plant metabolism. That's going to tie into tree immune function. So when apple scab happens, or brown rot on soft fruit, there is a disease pathogen spore in both those cases. I don't know if fire blight is relevant in Alaska yet. We'll touch on that. But all those things trigger a response in the tree in terms of its phytochemistry to resist disease. So there's ways that we can work with that, ways that we can enhance that. And as always, there's ways that we can screw it up. So to start to understand that, we'll start making better choices as growers. Competitive colonization, there I'm referring to the fact that there are many, many organisms and microbes. And just like I am sitting here, and you see one of me on this Zoom screen, I'm actually a community of 100 million organisms, some number like that. And without all my friends, I'd be in trouble. We're gonna learn what happens to fruit trees out in the natural environment in terms of microbe protectors and how we can reinforce that aspect. And then finally, I want to tie in the diversity piece, talk about different plant friends for fruit trees and berry plantings. And that's going to bring us into the realm of beneficial insect allies, but it's also going to loop back around to the fungal piece. So let's start there with fungal stewardship. So one of the first tenets here is this notion that nature builds soils via fungal connections, and I'm gonna place us on the edge of the forest. We're not going to stay on the edge of the forest, but I'm going to keep that construct in mind. Because when I started to ask the question of myself, where does an apple tree really want to grow? I started to hear on the edge of the forest, where the forest soil ecology is rampant. We're going to get into that. This picture has nothing to do with the talk on what I'm talking about right now. This is my daughter, Grace. This is what's known as a photo op moment. And back when I wrote Holistic Orchard, I needed her to help me demonstrate certain things. And to be honest, she's never mown in the orchard. And that machine isn't even running, but she did take a great picture, and it helped me make a point in the book. So when we're talking about soil organisms, the big picture here is the soil food web. And now we're looking at the Entocytomycetes and the bacteria and the saprotrophic fungal species that break down organic matter, the mycorrhizal fungi that have a relationship to the roots of all these different plants, ties in here. Then we go down to the next trophic layer. We're talking about nematodes and protozoa. Microbe consumes microbe. Minerals are released and assimilated. And some of that goes into the plant's nutrition profile. Some of it goes back into microbes. That's what the word assimilation means. But this whole concept of the soil food web, I think of this as my team. And in the usual human arrogant way, I think, I'm the captain of this team. I'm in charge. But in truth, I have one job as the captain of this team, and that is to not screw up the team. And getting that in your head is also really important, because it's going to really result in you being a better grower. So this notion of why the forest edge, it has to do with the right soil biology. And we're able to look at different soil ecosystems and through soil life testing, find out what's the size of the bacterial biomass, what's the size of the fungal biomass. And when you have the right kind of fungal foods in place, decaying young trees, very brittle stalked weeds, raspberry canes, providing the organic matter, you start to get into a more fungal place. And on the edge of the forest, that fungal dominance is on the order of 10 to 1. So this is not to say the bacteria are not important. They're very much a part of this. But this is not quite the same as deep in the old growth forest, where that fungal biomass is going to be as much as 100 to 1 more than the bacterial biomass. So this is what I mean by the forest edge. Not that you're literally growing alongside the woods, but that we're going to bring that soil ecology found there into our orchard, into our fruit plantings. Now, this is a picture of an arbuscule, which is a nutrient transfer mechanism of endomycorrhizal fungi. These are fungi that have a relationship with about 85% of all the plants on the planet. And I put this picture up just because it kind of sets the stage of how I'm thinking about how important this is. My wife, Nancy, is an herbalist. And in herbalism, there's this old doctrine called the doctrine of signatures. And in that, people would look at a plant, how it grows, where it grows, the shape of its leaf, and there'd be things that would suggest this might be a medicinal use for that plant. And it sounds kind of very simplified, but it also has some very deep aspects. And when I look at these arbuscules, what I see as a tree guy is it looks like a tree. Flip it around, upside down, it looks like the feeder root system of a plant. If you've been trained medically, it looks quite a lot like the alveoli in our lungs where oxygen gets exchanged. And when you think about tree, feeder root system, oxygen exchange, you know, we're touching on something that is like super important to there being life on this planet. And mycorrhizal fungi are in that category. So just very quickly introduce to you the two major types. Endomycorrhizal fungi, ENDO, that stands for within. Those are the ones that actually penetrate into the cell and form those arbuscules. And so what's notable about their hyphal mass outside the root is that it forms a dense mycelium pretty much where the roots go, but not too far, maybe 3-4 inches beyond the root surface where the hyphal reach can get nutrients. The ectomycorrhizae, the ones that are associated with the trees of the forest, both deciduous trees and coniferous trees, are not actually going into the cell of the root. They penetrate into the intercellular spaces. But what's notable about them is they have these explorer hyphae, which can reach as much as 12 feet away from the root. And that in turn gets you down to bedrock. And there's an ability to dissolve bedrock and through the fungal hyphae reaching down that far, bring nutrients back to the tree and to the plant community where that tree lives. So those constructs are going to come back to us, but that's just a very simplified view of what's happening in terms of mycorrhizal fungi. So this fact that a root is here and hyphae are coming out and expanding around it, it's pretty simple to understand. We're not just necessarily depending on groundwater and capillary action bringing nutrients to the plant. We have an active mechanism for seeking nutrients further out from the plant. So when people say that the fungal mycelium increases the tree's feeder root reach by 100 times, sometimes you'll hear 1,000 times, that's what I'm referring to. One fungi working with one plant. But when you complex that and you have many species of fungi, some forming multiple affiliations with the same plant, and then you have other plants with different fungal friends, but also some of the same fungal friends, you now get the fact that hyphae can interact through the plant protoplasm to essentially form one common mycorrhizal network. So this concept is really key to understanding why diversity is so important in a fruiting ecosystem, really any plant ecosystem. We want all the advantages of this common mycorrhizal network in place, because now we're talking about expanding a tree's feeder root system, its volume reach, by as much as 10,000 times, 100,000 times. There's a lot of collaboration and cooperation going on here that's going to change prospects for any individual plant in that community. This is a picture of my orchard. This would be probably about late May, maybe early June. Blossoms here are going to open anywhere on the apple, somewhere between the middle of May and the end of May. And you do not see apple trees necessarily in a straight line, growing in an herbicide strip with a little bit of grass in between them. What you see is a wild and woolly orchard ecosystem with all kinds of plants in it. And that's me reflecting that notion of understanding that the common mycorrhizal network really comes to be in all its fulfillment when you have the diversity in place with all kinds of plants. So one of the aspects of mycorrhizal understanding is knowing that when we come into a very degraded soil ecosystem, over tillage, suburban house lot where the topsoil has been stripped away, a cornfield where corn has been grown for 20, 30 years with herbicides. You can picture different scenarios. Just simply a thin soil situation, as you probably see in some parts of Alaska, like I do here in Granite, New Hampshire. And the other part of this puzzle is to understand that oftentimes tree rootstock, the berries we get from a nursery, don't necessarily have their fungal companions in place. It all depends on how they were grown. And many people are not giving this enough thought. So one of the things that can be very valuable is you want to certainly gain all the advantage of the mycorrhizae for the trees and the plants that you're going to be growing fruit with. And going about that by purchasing commercial inoculum is one way to jumpstart that process. So here I'm talking about the quality mycorrhizal inoculums that contain anywhere from as many as 9 different species of the endomycorrhizae. So ENDO, that word that means within the cell. Those are the species that affiliate with apple trees and peach trees and with all the berries that you'll be growing. They're very cosmopolitan species. They affiliate with many different plants, but we certainly want to get those key players involved. So mycorrhizae.com, bioorganics.com, Anyone watching in Canada, rootrescue.com are companies that offer products which have that wide species diversity. So one of the things I'm trying to emulate is we have discovered that in a healthy plant ecosystem, there will be as many as 50 different excuse me, fungal species found. And that's a reflection of that diversity piece. And in the endomycorrhizal realm, there's only as many as about 400 plus species of those fungi to begin with. They're very adept at working in all kinds of different ecosystems. So this picture that you see is a bare rootstock, MM111, and I have dipped it into the bioorganics root dip, which I kind of like because otherwise we do not see these fungi, we do not see these spores, but because it has that gel in which the inoculum is held, you can see that to a degree on the roots and get a sense of, yeah, I'm there, I'm working with mycorrhizae. Again, otherwise you're not going to be seeing these fungi. You can see the ectotypes on forest trees with our eye, but not the type that is forming that affiliation with most plants. So now we have this construct of let's bring the forest edge ecology underneath the tree. And here I'm talking about from the trunk out to the drip line and a couple of feet beyond. And the term I like to use here is, rather than say understory management, as a commercial orchardist might do, I like to say my focus is on fungal duff management. I want to make this a fungal place. I don't want to lose that connection right from the very start. So my word is fungal duff management. And that involves what are the right kind of fungal foods that are going to build this soil ecosystem populations in the direction I want to steer it. And this is going to have both saprotrophic fungi that are breaking down organic matter, but some of the species of mycorrhizal fungi will get involved with that action. Other mycorrhizal species are going to be taking up nutrients, not so much from breaking down organic matter, but it's a complex scene. We just want to make sure it's going in that fungal direction. So one of the things that I talk about in the book, and you'll see on the website, is this concept of ramial wood chips, R-A-M-I-A-L. This was a term that was first coined in Quebec at Laval University, where the researchers were looking at what can we do with the tops of trees, the smaller parts, the branches, left from logging jobs to boost agricultural fertility. So obviously tops of trees can be left in the forest to build forest fertility. That's important as well. But when we take those tops of those trees, what's the nuance behind that? So one of the things they said was we're talking about branches that are 7 centimeters in diameter or less. So just in my head, I think of that as 2 inches. And the smaller portion of the branch proportionally has a lot more green inner bark cells, the cambium. This is where the nutrients are stored. So when I'm putting that down, I'm getting quite a mix of fungal nutrition, some nitrogen to go with the small core of wood where the carbon is really packed in. When you chip bigger portions of trees, then you end up with a much higher carbon to nitrogen ratio on the order of as high as 700 to 1. That's a totally different dynamic. And another thing that they learned is that if the tree species are deciduous, they have 2 types of lignins that white rot decomposition fungi are going to break down. And the white rots are kind of the prime players on the planet for creating humic compounds, long-term fertility. If it's mostly coniferous sourced wood chips, that is going to be broken down by the brown rots. There's only one form of lignin in those trees. There's a lot of cellulose. And the brown rots, in the process of beginning to decompose that material, produce allelopathic compounds that, and this is important, inhibit the growth of deciduous trees. So that's really important to understand from the perspective of I just planted young trees. You know, as a tree comes into bearing, it's bigger, and you are haphazardly distributing that mulch, by which I mean you're not trying to make everything look uniform, but you're essentially emulating the forest edge. Things are wild and woolly out on the edge of the forest. That's not as much concern. And then we could spend more time, and we will in the next session, talking about some of the nuance here with raw meal wood chips. So as a reminder, everything I've just talked about with respect to endomycorrhizal fungi, the common mycorrhizal network, is invisible to our eye. And as growers, not only do we need to be conscious of it, but I found it's really helpful to be visualizing what's going on there. Because again, this is a core part of my team, and I don't want to screw things up. I want to make things right. And as a final fungal note, I'll leave you with this. We're often introduced in agriculture, whether you're doing this commercially or in your home orchard, to fungi as a problem, as different fungal diseases like apple scab, like brown rot, any of the fruit rots. They're all caused by fungi, but that's a really small portion of the fungal kingdom. And when we start to understand that the saprotrophs, the ones that break down organic matter, along with the mycorrhizal fungi, along with all the shelf mushrooms and the yeasts that are on the surface of the plant, the reason we can crush apples and take that juice and ferment it without introducing yeast is because yeast is there. It's ubiquitous. We're not going to get into it today, but the endophytic fungi that live within the cambium cells and their hyphae emerge out onto the surface of the leaf is a whole nother fascinating realm. But there's all these other fungi that, rather than thinking of it as a problem, as a disease factor, we have to start to understand they're really important as an ally, as a friend, as part of how the tree functions in nature to be healthy. So let's move on to mineralization. So plant metabolism, very quickly, we are talking about not just being a green leaf out there in the sunshine, but that as a leaf, photosynthesis happens. And carbon dioxide is, through basically alchemy, I think of it, is converted partly into glucose sugar energy. That glucose sugar is how a plant grows, how it reproduces, forms seed. But those same sugars are traded down through the roots to the soil biology, of which the mycorrhizal fungi are one of the benefiters. One of the purposes of this union between fungi and plant is to, the fungi get the carbon sugar, the energy, and the plant in exchange gets mineral nutrition. So that's why I'm bringing that in here. So plants go on from there to take those carbon sugars and combine them with nitrogen to create proteins. We're going to learn that complete protein synthesis is very important in terms of resisting both disease and pests. Fats come into play. So the fatty acids are going to be utilized by the fruit tree to form a cuticle over the leaf and on the fruit. That's part of the kind of the first front in which rot organisms have to penetrate to rot your fruit. But it's also the way that the tree stores energy for a rainy day. It's also one of the forms of foods that are really important to mycorrhizal fungi. And finally, if all those metabolic processes are going really good, the plant starts to form what are known as secondary plant metabolites. And these are the terpenes, the flavonoids, the phenol compounds that are basically that resistance mechanism, the resistance metabolites of the tree in terms of phytochemistry. We want this metabolism process to get all the way through all those steps, because that, in a very quick sense, is the definition of why one plant is healthy and another plant is not. So starting with photosynthesis, I just want to introduce the concept to you that not all photosynthesis is the same. A plant in an agricultural system, subject to chemistry, if I'm talking corn, soybeans, subject to tillage, herbicides, etc., may be operating at as little as 25% or so of its photosynthesis capacity. And if a plant, and now we're going back into the orchard, doesn't have access to the full array of mineral nutrition, these minerals act as cofactor enzymes to help that metabolic process be more efficient. Without that array of minerals being available, photosynthesis will also be subdued in our orchards. And that in turn means that there's less carbon sugars being produced to trade with the most vital trading partner there is if you're a plant. So we want photosynthesis to be important. So I'm going to be talking about, when we get to sprays, including foliar tonic formulations of minerals. One of the products I use is MicroPack, which comes from Advancing Eco Ag in Ohio. Sea Crop is made in Washington State, and that's dehydrated ocean water without the high salt content. These are products that provide a lot of those minerals. So one of the ways we can supplement mineralization is through our use of sprays. You're going to be hearing from me about, the sprayer is a tool, and it's our choice what we put in there. A lot of times people have this construct: I'd grow fruit, but I don't want to spray. Well, I'm going to give you a lot of reasons why you're going to come to understand it is a very good tool, because rather than going the allopathic route, it's one of the ways I can deliver some holistic backup. So here's an example of another thing I do, fermented plant extracts. And this is taking herbs that grow in the orchard or nearby, things like comfrey leaf, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, which is very high in calcium. Things like horsetail, Equisetum arvens, which is very high in silica. And this is something that I can essentially ferment in drums and then strain to get a very nutrient-rich brew. So I'm actually working on figuring more of this out, because I don't necessarily want to buy in more inputs, more products, pay shipping. If I can do it on the farm, that to me is like that's a victory. The more I can do from within the farm as its own organism, that's a biodynamic principle. So currently I do basically I'll call it a calcium brew. Again, it's the comfrey, the green nettle. You'll see there's some milk in that as well. And for silica, I'm primarily working with horsetail and nettle when it goes to seed. There's other plants that can be used. This is not like some strict recipe. So if marsh grasses, which are very brittle, they have high silica levels. You can figure it out for where you live, plants that might contribute to kinds of nutrition that you need. And we won't dwell on that now. There you get this sense of spray day. I go strain it through a second time before I put it into the spray tank. But that brown liquid there is just rich in all kinds of nutrients without essentially costing me $1 a gallon at most. So that's also very friendly and generous in terms of making this economic when you're trying to make a living. There are other ways that we can work with this. So seaweed. Some of you might live close enough to the ocean, you can actually gather your own seaweed. I buy kelp meal, which is primarily fed through our sheep, whose poop ends up on the compost pile. Sometimes I might do a dusting on the compost pile. Azomite clay is a mineral deposit from the Southwest that supposedly contains all the minerals from A to Z. This is something that I use in the planting hole when planting out a tree. This is another great soil amendment to use as a dusting on compost piles as you're building layers, because you're going to spread that compost. It might as well be very mineral rich. Gypsum, calcium sulfate, is very valuable for both the calcium aspect and the sulfur aspect. I know Burl told me in Alaska, many of you, maybe all of you, are dealing with heavy clay soil. Well, gypsum is typically used, I think this is a term that comes from the South, as a land plaster. Today, we're familiar with it as sheetrock, drywall, but calcium sulfate is something that helps spread clay particles apart. So calcium, a little higher number there, structurally helps the soil open up and be more aerated. And then finally, rock dusts are available sometimes locally from a quarry. And basalt dust is particularly valuable. I use granite meal often. And again, it might be like, this is something that gets sprinkled on the compost pile. I'm not necessarily getting out there under the trees all the time. There's different ways. That's the seed I'm trying to plant here, of how you can work to boost mineralization. Rudolf Steiner gave a series of talks in the 1924 in Germany, in which became the basis of biodynamic agriculture. And without going much further into what biodynamics is all about, he made this statement in the 1920s about plants and the fungi interlacing together and forming a common root being. This was a time when we could not see this. We didn't have the electron microscope yet. I think Steiner was a little bit of a psychic in this sense. But what he's talking about there is the common mycorrhizal network. So I'm planting that seed again here. Topic currently is mineralization, but I want you to really understand a lot of that happens through the fungal network. So we're back weaving tenet 1 in with tenet 2. One of the ways I say this is that when people talk about nutrient density in the vegetables we grow and the produce, the fruit that we pick from the trees, that's essentially a reflection of life density in the soil. Getting back to this idea of the soil food web, our primary teammates, so to speak, not screwing things up, really celebrating that soil is alive. This is a picture of some cider apples from my friend Autumn at Eve's Cidery. She's taking the bricks of that fruit. Bricks is a measure of not just sugars, but also the protein content. So during the growing season, I'll use a refractometer to measure the bricks of the plant sap in the leaf. And a high number on the order of 14 to 18 is the goal. A number that's more like 12, 10, 8, not doing so well. And that measure is reflecting a good mineral abundance, a balance of minerals available to that plant so that it can have efficient photosynthesis, efficient protein synthesis, and efficient fat synthesis. That was a lot of synthesis. So let's now carry this forward to tree immune function. So here I'm talking about phytochemistry and that whole plant metabolism I introduced a little bit ago. This is where the resistance metabolites are created by which plants can counter the strategies that disease organisms have created to be able to tap into the nutrient resources of the plant. And there's 3 ways of looking at this. One is environmental reality, that interaction going on. If it didn't happen at all, we wouldn't have the phytochemistry going on to the same degree. That's not so good. There are things that we can apply to the surface of the plant through sprays that act as inducing elicitors of some of this phytochemistry. And finally, the construct of reserve energy, that a plant is able to go through all the stages of plant metabolism to get to the finish line. So when we talk about disease, we're also talking about something we can't really see. Where does apple scab from? Where did that brown rot, which totally destroyed my pie cherry crop, come from? Well, it's all invisible. And it's very easy to be fearful of something that you can't see. That has led us into a whole lot of construct of how we're going to deal with it. But on the other hand, a little bit of that is a good thing. So in organics, people use mineral fungicides like sulfur, copper, lime sulfur. I'm not going to talk about the specifics of that today, but all of that would be under the banner of organic allopathy. These are materials that are intended to either destroy or hinder in a big way the establishment of that disease. And if you super overdo this, or you have incredibly effective chemical fungicides, same principle, allopathy, you end up with a plant that doesn't have to deal with environmental reality. You end up with fruit that doesn't have all the phytochemicals that our body has used to ward off our own forms of human degenerative disease. That's not a good thing. We don't want to clean the slate so much that we don't have that going on. So now some of the things that will induce the systemic resistance response are other microbes. So if you work with compost teas or effective microorganisms, that's part of what's going on there. Minerals, so I mentioned seed crop earlier. different nutrients in a spray formulation kick this in. Seaweed is noted for all kinds of providing all kinds of vitamins and minerals and hormones. So kelp extracts in the spray tank is going to do some of that. When I am making those fermented plant extracts, it's those terpenoids and those phenols and alkaloids that I'm extracting in part into the water, not just basic mineral elements, but some of that chemistry. And all these things can be rolled into a holistic spray program. And this is Jerry Bernetti. He founded a company in Pennsylvania called Agrodynamics. He's passed on. He's an incredible teacher in terms of thinking deeply about plant nutrition. And he came to recognize, it's not just using one of these elicitors, it's using multiple mechanisms to unfold a phytochemistry that can resist disease on many different fronts. That's important. So when I talk about what I call the holistic core recipe, that's at the heart of my spray management aspects of orcharding, I am talking about a mix of seed oils. There's some neem oil and karanja oil. Talking about fish hydrolysate, which is cold processed liquid fish that contains all the fatty acids of the fish, not just the hormones and the nutrients, but it's those fats that I'm interested in. Seaweed extract and some version of a microbial inoculant. And in one sense, you could say, well, what are the active ingredients in your sprays? Well, trace minerals, fatty acids, microbe diversity. This is a whole different construct than naming off toxic chemicals as the fatty, the active ingredients in that spray. So what's some of the relevance of this? Insect pests that feed on the foliage. So here we're talking about caterpillars, talking about aphids, talking about leaf miners, there's many. They are attracted to plants that have an excess of simple sugars and amino acids in that plant sap. Now, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And when protein synthesis is complete, then there's less amino acids. The pests, the insects are not drawn to feed off that plant. But similarly, those disease pathogens that have to wiggle their hyphae into the leaf cell, like apple scab, do not find the free amino acids which they need to get their start. So when plant metabolism is robust, photosynthesis is robust, what a huge leg up. We're not talking about pests and disease as this overwhelming force, and that's the focus of what we do in fruit growing. We're talking about, yeah, it happens sometimes, but it's part of environmental reality, and we get a good crop, and we're pretty happy. So if we were getting into this whole view of what the holistic spray program looked like, I break it into spring sprays, and there we're dealing primarily with the primary infection window of most of the leaf spotting diseases, like apple scab. We're also dealing with certain bacterial onslaughts, like fire blight. The comprehensive sprays, that period right after fruit sets, we're talking about a lot of high nutrition needs that are taking place for cell division. And that's a very important time in terms of the fruit's development so that it later sizes and has a lot of quality. Summer sprays, we're primarily focused on addressing rots, but we're also keeping those nutrient levels up there. So photosynthesis remains robust. And finally, I do a fall holistic spray, which is really aimed often at where certain pests and certain diseases are going to overwinter so that there's less of that come the next growing season. But I'm also talking about tying into the fall feeder root flush, which is when the fruit trees are taking up nutrients that are going to pop next year's leaves. So there's lots of concepts here. You're hearing that. And, we're kind of just touching and overviewing, but that's a good place to start in terms of what's taking place here. Now, this is a picture from friends of mine in South Australia. They have an operation called Kalangadoo Orchard, and they grow lots of beautiful organic apples. They were getting a little bit tired of dealing with apple scab, making many sulfur sprays, not feeling very successful at it. And one of the things we talked about was because they're in a region where straw is readily available from the growing of wheat and other grain crops, That was primarily the basis of their understory, their mulch management in these dwarf tree rows. And without the woody component, the lignin component, they didn't have the same diversity of organisms. And that in turn meant that disease had an edge because mineralization and the biology wasn't all it could be. So when I talk about fungal ascendancy, this notion that we want to make this fungal duff zone, one of the things that's happening there is we're creating conditions that are really right for plant metabolism to be robust, which in turn means that energy is saved in each of those steps. Photosynthesis, creating the sugars, the proteins being formed, the fatty acids being formed, resistance metabolites being formed. When it's done efficiently, there's enough energy to get to the other side. And so it all ties together. It's beautiful. This is a picture of one of the green men in my barn. And I have to be in the mood to answer this question because customers are coming, they're buying apples. But this particular green man says, what do spots have to do with healthy apples? And I essentially push the little playback button and give a 45-second spiel about environmental reality, and that produces phytochemicals. And so if there's an apple or two on the tree subject to scab, wow, that's so beautiful, because that means all the other fruit on that tree, all the other leaves, all the plant cells, the cambium cells, the plant sap, the roots were involved in a phytochemistry that's also good for us. And we taste that in the flavor, but we also ultimately experience it by being healthier ourselves. Let's do the competitive colonization piece. So now we're talking about, we've talked about the soil food web. I'm going to now bring that biology up into the tree on both the bark surfaces, the leaf surfaces, the fruit surfaces. And I'm going to refer to this as the arboreal food web. And now I introduce this construct that out there in the sunshine, in the cold wind, in the dry times, in the ultraviolet radiation, in acid rain, all these different things happen that can reduce microbe populations on the surface of the plant. And it turns out, and this is a number I first heard from Elaine Ingham of the soil food web, that when colonization remains on the order of 70% or higher, that's enough to really change the prospects of a disease organism landing on that leaf and being able to go through the enzyme steps to penetrate into that cell in order to get nutrition to become a scab infection or to become cherry leaf spot infection. So more organisms means more defenses. And again, all these things can happen to plants. And on top of that, humans can make choices. So the use of chemical fungicides in particular, but also the overuse of things like sulfur, even the use of lime sulfur can negate these micropopulations. So as you start to learn about that, you start to make choices. Sometimes you need that tool. You need that allopathic tool. You just do, especially when you're making a living at it and you have a certain cosmetic standard you have to meet. But we want to start to be much more discerning upon our calling on that, because it impacts the microbe populations, which are really part of that front line defense. Another thing that's going on for the microbes, so there are foodstuffs falling from the sky. There are leaf exudates coming out of the leaf that can feed these populations. But there are times when they simply run out of food resources. So when I talk about neem oil, karanja oil, fish hydrolysate in my sprays, part of what I'm about there is providing fatty acids to feed that arboreal food web. Again, this tapestry, it's beautiful the way it all comes together. So my primary way of reintroducing biology, reinforcing the numbers, is using something called effective microorganism cultures, which are primarily yeast and lactobacilli. There's some other organisms in there as well that I can brew, I can activate. And so I can do that very economically in barrels or you could be doing this in a 5-gallon container. You could be doing it in gallon jugs. But that's part of my spray recipe because I want to reintroduce those organisms, replenish populations, so I keep more or less that 70% colonization. During bloom time in the orchard, apples, pears in particular here, I don't know if any of you are dealing with fire blight, but you all know it's warming, so these things are coming if you're not yet. But fire blight, primarily this bacterial pathogen, gets in through the open flower. And so I changed my spray recipe for that moment in time. I call it a competitive colonization boost, and I up the rate of microbes. I no longer use neem oil because I don't want to impact the pollinators. And I up the rate of seaweed a little bit from my usual because it has high flavonoid content. Similarly, I up the rate of Karanja oil for the flavonoid content. That is a phytochemical that's very useful to the plant, stimulates its own production, which works to ward off bacteria. So I'm plugging into what we know about the pathogen, and I'm also deliberately timing these sprays on open blossoms because when it was bud, tight pink, inside was virgin territory. But when that flower opened, who's going to be there first? I wanted to make sure it was the good guys. This is a picture. I love how we have electron microscopy now. We can see things that there's no way we could see this. This is a picture of a stomate, a respiration cell on the underside of a leaf. And there's a number of diseases. Black rot is probably something you deal with. Another name for that would be frog eye leaf spot. Those of you on the coast in the wetter zones. In the east here, we deal with something called cedar apple rust. These pathogens have all evolved the strategy of going right in through the stomate to get into the plant resources, into the nutrition of the sap. But if there's a bunch of guards around that doorway, this is where I'm talking about that recolonization, that competitive organisms protecting that doorway, then those pathogens do not have the same success rate. You get the idea. It's very complex, but it's so very beautiful. And when we start working with it, we start having far more success than really what we've seen over the last 100 years. I mean, that's a whole nother talk, I think. Let me also just quickly introduce this because it's under this banner of competitive colonization. So in biodynamics, there's this construct of biodynamic tree paste. And at its very simplest, you'll see more involved recipes, but at its very simplest, this is a mix of some form of native clay and some form of humus-rich matter. So that could be fresh cow manure. That's, if you're a purist, that's what's recommended. It could be the sheep or goat manure. It could be nice compost. If it's a real pinch, it could be good topsoil, because those things all contain lots of good organisms. So I think of the clay as kind of a spa treatment, but the humus component of the biodynamic tree paste acts to occupy the niche where canker organisms, and now we're talking about fire blight, we're talking about black rot, we're talking about perennial canker, we're talking about bacterial canker on stone fruit trees. Doing this treatment, slathering it on the bark surface, is a way you start to change that dynamic. And there's actually growers who make a thin enough slurry to spray throughout the tree canopy as a biodynamic approach to dealing with anthracnose. I know that's like a major challenge in the Pacific Northwest, and probably some of you in the wetter parts of Alaska are dealing with that as well. But again, you're getting this idea, there's like these earth remedies that you can make from materials that are available on your farm or on your homestead, and you can help the tree the way nature designed it all to work, which again is pretty cool. So the diversity piece. So one aspect of this is lots of plants forming that common mycorrhizal network. Another part is that plants, through the deeper root systems, And that can be as simple as a dandelion going 6 or 8 inches, or comfrey going out down several feet, maybe not down, but over. But they bring nutrients back into those plants, which in turn, when they decompose, those minerals go back into the soil, right in that top high fertility zone where tree feeder roots and microbes are going to be accessing a lot of nutrition. So here's a picture underneath one of my apple trees. And somewhat on the perimeter, it's funny, I'm here all by myself in the room with this Zoom screen, and I want to point to that, which you can't even see me pointing what I'm pointing to. But the comfrey, the big leaf plants, I'll typically plant clumps of that here and there around the drip line, because comfrey works as this wonderful calcium accumulator. But it also works as a living mulch plant in that it falls over in one direction, smothers grasses so it doesn't get quite so thick under the tree. But I'm into diversity, so it's not just comfrey. There are some grasses there. There's different herbs there. The plants right in front, in this case, there's some valerian, which has a very tiny flower, which attracts parasitic wasps, which help take care of some of the pests. And these plants don't have to be right under the tree, but sometimes they are. They have to be in the orchard ecosystem to get that aspect. Now, here's another thing I want to tie in. Some of you are probably familiar with some polyculture ideas or permaculture ideas. And one of those is to grow nitrogen fixing shrubs in the vicinity of fruit plants so that those nitrogen fixers make some more nitrogen available, which the fruit roots can pick up as well. And when you're growing something like a shrub form of alder or willow, Siberian pea shrub, buffalo berry, you don't want that plant to become dominant for the sunshine because you're growing fruit. And often one of the ways to manage that plant is through coppicing. Now, that means taking out the branches, and these are plants that readily regrow from the root system. And this was severe coppicing. Everything's been cut. It could be that you cut 2-year-old stems and you let this plant grow and photosynthesize a little bit more. And they don't have to be made into wood chips necessarily either. You can lay branches down around fruit trees. You throw some hay or compost over them, and what you've created are pockets of mini hugelkultur. That's a permaculture idea. But basically, woody matter being slightly buried becomes a real haven for fungi. So here you've got this plant dynamic fixing nitrogen, but it's also a source of ramial organic matter right there in the vicinity of your trees, maybe on the edge of your orchard planting. But it even gets cooler. Going back now to the fungal piece, when I talked about ectomycorrhizae having these explorer hyphae that can go as much as 12 feet, and how apple trees, fruit trees, berry plants don't have that relationship with ectomycorrhizae. Well, our fruiting plants can tap into that action by means of what are known as the soft hardwoods. So here I'm specifically talking about plants like alder and willow and popple. And when they're growing in the vicinity of the orchard, they're not right there in the drip line. They might be 100 feet, 200 feet away, but there's a vibrant plant community between. Those are species of trees that have both the ecto aspect and an endo aspect. And so they bridge these two mycorrhizal systems. That in turn means some of the nutrients from the bedrock is now being pumped into plants in between on its way to the orchard trees, some of which that nutrition will be used by the orchard trees. But a lot of this we don't know. I'm really cool with the idea that everything I'm talking about, I know only like 5% of it. It's all being discovered, to be discovered. Maybe it's beyond our comprehension as human beings, but what I do totally understand is that little bit I know, I totally want to respect and honor, because it does so much to make good stuff happen that help me be a successful fruit grower. So incorporating diversity, plant in clumps. You can get many different things. I don't know the plants of Alaska the way I do in the Northeast. Think about flower bloom throughout the season to support the native pollinators. Think about some grasses. They provide structural support, but they also provide different mycorrhizae. get that construct in your head. These different plants have different fungal partners, which is making your common mycorrhizal network, Steiner's common root being, all the more diverse, all the more working for you. What do insect allies need? That ladybug is there for aphid larvae, but it also needs places to live, and in particularly to overwinter. The adults need food because it's the larva of the beneficial often that is doing the job that you want done. But the adults also need to thrive, so there's more of the young to take care of the pests. I'm going to give you an example, and we know a few of these kinds of stories. This may not be relevant to Alaska at all, but if you were in the Pacific Northwest, I know you'd be dealing with peach twig borer and oriental fruit moth larva, which is a cousin of codling moth. There is a particular braconid wasp called macrocentrist. I'm not even going to attempt the second word. That is really adept at finding larvae of those two major fruit pests, if you're in the place that they live, and parasitizing it on the order of 80–90%. That's the kind of natural advantage you want. And it isn't that it just happens and you're lucky that macrocentrist is there. If you have those pests, you can encourage that particular beneficial species by understanding some very simple things. One is that early in spring, before the pests of oriental fruit moth, peach twig borer are active, there are food sources on strawberries. And so here I'm talking about strawberry leaf rollers. So macrocentrists that are in your ecosystem have something to get started with. And then it moves on to the fruit plant. And then if you plant sunflowers, which is beyond the window when oriental fruit moth and twig borer are active, sunflowers attract sunflower moths, which becomes more food for macrocentrists. And then if you get over any kind of inkling in yourself that you got to clean everything up, be like super neat human being, and you let the sunflower stalks be, that's where macrocentrists overwinters. And so they're going to have higher numbers to start the spring season. So here you are managing ecology, choice of some plants in the ecosystem, but that in turn is adding up to an incredible beneficial power that is dealing with direct pest issues. So again, there's more of these stories. That's one of my favorite to tell. Steiner, again, everything in nature is interdependent, everything. I think you're getting that idea. And as you start to understand how all these pieces come together, then I call it the magic. The magic happens, and you're growing fruit far more successfully without resorting to allopathy. Now, I'm going to give Burl some credit here. When I told him I wanted to talk about the 5 tenets of holistic orcharding, he came back at me with a commandment to do with your brown bear situation. Thou shalt fence thy orchard. And in the spirit of that, Burl, I thought, well, let's run with this. What are some other Alaskan commandments that we could be looking at here? Thou shalt loosen impervious clay. I got that point. We need to deal with the clay factor. And hold on to the fact that microbes, the soil food web, is one of your primary players in changing that dynamic. And then, like me, I have this same commandment here in northern New Hampshire. Thou shalt only dream of persimmons and some of the fruits that you hear about growing in warmer places. Anyway, we're going to go into the question and answer period, and I will stop the share and look for Burl to float to the surface.
Okay.
There you are.
Hey. Well, thank you, Michael. That was a fine romp through a very broad and subject matter that I am personally vaguely familiar with through your writing. I want to go ahead. I guess I'll leave the mute button on for everybody. You can unmute yourself, I'm pretty sure. If somebody wants to ask a question, you may. And you can also use the chat feature to simply ask a question through chat, which will pop up and will allow us to see what you're asking and respond that way. So you don't have to write a chat. You can just say something, but unmute yourself only if you're going to ask a question, and stay muted, please, if you're not. Okay, Pauline Strong is asking, is there anything toxic in sheetrock?
It's a good question, Pauline. This is where nuance comes in. So if you're a certified organic grower, you're not allowed to use sheetrock scraps in the orchard, even though if it's plain old drywall, regular drywall, there is no issue to it. But in the bureaucratic realm, you have to cover all the bases, and so they say no. And why is that? That is because some of the sheetrock, particularly the green board that would be used in bathroom setting, has been treated with mildewcides. And so that's a chemical that in an organic setting you wouldn't want. On the other hand, you know, I've been a builder for probably 40 years, and it just would drive me nuts to think I can buy gypsum in a bag, but I have to throw these sheetrock scraps away that are left when I cut out windows and doorways. So I have utilized sheetrock in my orchard. Regular drywall will be treated with less than 1% boric acid. That's okay. But in the same hand, as I'm telling you this, you know, I don't go to the lumber yard and come back with 40 sheets of sheetrock and lay it out end to end down the orchard row. It's like a little pile here and there. Throw some hay or compost or earth over it, so I'm not looking at like piles of trash in my orchard. It's that kind of construct. Be haphazard about it, understand the nuance, and you could utilize sheetrock, yes.
I want to give the Eric Hawley of Haynes has asked, noted that a previous presenter recommended disposing of prunings and berry bushes by burning and removing lichens and mosses from the tree. And do you have any comment on that or agree with that? In other words, removing them from the stems.
No, I have comments. So I'm gonna answer this from the biological perspective, not the human, oh, we gotta sanitize everything perspective. So in the instance of berry prunings, which might be a source of viruses that came from wild canes, got established in your plantings. This is often one of the primary explanations for the demise of a berry patch over time, many years. It is a good practice to make sure those canes are not just lying there on the ground, exposed to release virus, bacteria, whatever might be a problem. On the other hand, just like I talked with coppiced branches, to take those prunings and lay them in a low spot and cover it with hay or leaf litter or some compost or some dirt, you change the ecosystem in which the pathogen organism lived in an aerial ecosystem to a soil ecosystem where that pathogen organism does not do its thing. Similarly, when I am pruning my fruit trees, I don't want a lot of branches and I can't quite walk through the orchard. You know, I might do that with a coppice plant and a little brush pile here and there. But I throw a lot of the littler stuff down to the ground, and I may cut it into smaller pieces as I think about my next pruning cut, or I may not. Bigger branches are thrown in the aisle. They're going to go to my wood chipper, but I'm doing a very forest edge thing there. Branches that come off a tree fall to the ground and they decompose. They're fungal food. And again, I'm going from the aerial environment to a soil environment, and that shifts it. Now this whole fascination with the fact that lichens and moss must be somehow taking from the tree. It's a reflection of a less sunny environment. It's a reflection of, yeah, it's kind of an ecosystem reflection. A less vigorous growing plant is going to be subject to that. But what is that lichen? What is that moss? That represents a plant ecosystem where different biology can thrive. And there may be some symbiotic relationship between the fruit tree and that lichen, that moss, that we don't know about yet. But I also know it's a place where good guys can thrive, can hide, can be, and then, so to speak, come out. It may be a place where epiphytic fungi in the cambium cells, which we have no idea as humans what they're doing, may actually come out and get some nutrients to take back to the cambium cells in exchange for carbon. And I want to be real clear. I'm speculating on that piece. But again, as humans, we have no idea why those fungi are there. So it's more complex, and let's just clean everything and make it look the way we think it should look. There could be really positive things there. And personally, I don't believe lichens and moss are causing any problem whatsoever. But beyond that, I think there could be some positive aspects to that. Are you muted, Burl? Burl, you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Rob Goldberg, did you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. I do have a question. Hi, Michael. It's nice to see you, and thank you so much for your presentation. It's got a lot of things going in my mind. I have about 24 fruit trees that I grow outside, and then I have about 24 in a large greenhouse. And the ones in the greenhouse do much better than the ones outside, just as far as protecting the trees and adding heat. I put down lots and lots of leaves on the floor of the greenhouse that I rake up in the fall, deciduous leaves. And I also put down seaweed in there. And I have a row of raspberries along the south wall that's 48 feet long. In good years, I can harvest a gallon of raspberries every day for about 2 months from that row of raspberries. But over time, I've noticed that some of the raspberries have the little fruitlets will be black and hard. And I'm suspecting that this is some sort of fungal disease or bacterial disease, and it's gotten worse over the last few years. And I'm wondering if you or anyone else knows what this is and what I might be able to do about it.
I'd be fascinated to tour your greenhouse and learn some of the things you've learned about growing fruit in that setting and how you deal with the chill factor and dormant season. I don't have a specific name for the hard cluster of berries. So yes, is it fungal? I think that's probably likely. And whenever I think about a disease, I think about where its launching pad, where does it maybe overwinter? And one thing that comes to my mind, and again, I don't really know your system there with indoor growing for fruit plants, but one thing that comes to my mind here is when I've grown tomatoes in a growing tunnel, I came to understand that some of the spores that cause the blight diseases actually overwintered on the surface, the inside surface of the solar plastic. And that needed to be wiped down and cleaned up. So I have no idea if that's what's going on with the raspberry. Another thought that comes to my head is in blueberries, there's something called mummyberry. And mummyberry is a fungal disease that causes the blueberries to get hard and shrink, and that overwinters in the debris, the organic matter on the floor at the base of the blueberry plant. And so there, the idea is in the spring to renew the mulch so that you cover those little fungal shooting caps, basically a mushroom, but it's not a mushroom, where those spores are going to come from. So you block it. So I'll look into this idea of what this potential disease is, because that can be more helpful to actually know its cycle. But those are some thoughts that come to my mind about where's that launching pad. And then of course you have the other piece, which is when is the primary infection window happening? So you're seeing these fruit, but did that happen before it even flowered? We know that the timing in terms of apple scab, but the spray schedule, if you're applying holistic sprays to your fruit trees, I hit my berries. I do our garden crops because these principles I've been sharing today have relevance to plants. And this is about what plants do. When I have the primary infection window of scab going on, my sprays are a little tightened up, more like 7+ days apart. In the summer, it's more like 2 weeks apart. So I know that in high pressure situations, there's a time I need to really keep things primed in terms of tree immune function and also competitive colonization. But again, you know, I'm curious now, so I'll look to learn what maybe this is. And, you know, having this conversation, if someone else knows exactly what it is, you could save us a whole lot of trouble right now. But those are the things I would think of.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and just to respond to some of your points, in the spring, I do put down a layer of compost through the entire row of berries. So I am covering up the soil. I don't prune out my old canes until the spring. And so maybe that's an issue. Maybe that disease is overwintering on the old canes. Maybe I should get them out of there in the fall instead of in the spring.
My understanding of old canes, so here I grow both the raspberries that have the 2-year cycle and also the 1-year cycle, the so-called fall raspberries. And my understanding of the old cane, so with the ones that have fruited and the cane dies, once it's dead, you can take it out. Now with the raspberries that have the 1-year cycle, there you want to wait until the leaves are totally died back because it's photosynthesizing and putting energy into the roots. So with the first type of the spring raspberry, the June raspberry, we call it here, I often, well, I should say, I have a goal to remove those canes in the fall when the apple harvest starts, and I do some of it. I never do all of it because I get busy, but you could. So maybe that is something to give some thought to, because those canes are not photosynthesizing late into the fall like the other type of berry.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
I have a question from Sue Chase, and we had a presentation, and it's interesting, Rob, the two Robs, Rob Bishop and Rob Goldberg, both have fruit trees. One uses containerized fruit trees, and Rob Goldberg uses trees planted in the ground. And Sue Chasen is asking, how do you provide biodiversity for fruit trees grown in containers?
No, that's where my mind goes. So the container aspect, and that Rob could speak to this, I would think of as maybe part of how you deal with the chill factor, getting enough dormant time at a cold temperature. And there may be other reasons for that. And so now you can't necessarily, you know, it's not unlike growing marijuana plants in a hydroponic system. I mean, it's better because you have this soil ball. I don't know how big this container is. And there are some plants you could certainly grow with that, be it arugula or not arugula, a juga, a low growing cover. And I guess you could create a kind of a mini mycorrhizal, common mycorrhizal network in that sense. And you won't necessarily have all the fungal players. So from the perspective of what I've been speaking about, you know, in the ground, I see more advantages. But I also don't know the whole nuance of inside growing. So either Rob could speak to that more. I think it's a great question.
Okay. I'll ask another one here. We've got a good lineup of 11 questions here. From Aleka Fullerton, what are the implications of using very old conifer wood, conifer wood chips in your orchard garden? In other words, using conifer and old material versus the deciduous.
Okay, so when I mentioned that word hugelkultur, that idea is it's going and finding fallen trees, essentially. It's not necessarily the brushy part, and burying it because it becomes a fungal bank for a long time nearby to where you're growing plants. And I've seen people do this to different scales. That mulchy matter is good organic matter. It's somewhat gone through the allelopathic phase of brown rot decomposition. Often when I get more softwood, spruce, fir, pine chips from the Asplund company, the ones that clear under the power lines, etc. If it's mostly coniferous, I'll direct that like into blueberry mulch in the past, or I'll put it in for sheep bedding or for bottom layer of the chicken bedding when we clean out the pen. And the other thing I'll do is I will definitely age that. So I make an orchard compost, which goes beyond the heating phase, the bacterial phase, and I'll give it 6 to 12 months. I'll add more wood chips at that point, so I up the carbon content, and that in turn helps aerate the pile, and fungi can thrive in that, so I don't continue to turn the pile. I'm introducing many constructs, which is what I love about question and answer time. But as far as that organic matter from the pines, I think it has a lot of value. But don't think of it as letting go of some of the other pieces. I'm thinking of that Kalangadoo orchard and just mulching with straw. If you can introduce some other types of organic matter, and again, the deciduous tree types have these 2 different lignins, and they draw a different decomposition rot, which gets you to more long-term fertility in terms of humus. And another way to think about pines and spruces and firs in the long-term kind of history, as that material decomposes, what do you get? You get peat bogs. And so you want to break that up. Fruit trees don't grow in peat bogs. It's useful, but again, keep your eye on diversity.
I'm going to ask a question of myself here. Whitney Rapp, can you please clarify your question for me? I'm not quite there with it. I think you left a word or two out, but I'll get back to that. So, Michael, in looking at your material from the apple grower and from the holistic orchard, basically the 30-to-1 that comes from the ramial chipping of deciduous stems, the carbon nitrogen ratio of roughly 30-to-1 for these small stems. And I've sort of made the assumption that material can be used directly without composting. Is that accurate?
Yes. So I don't totally remember these numbers. So the very smallest portions of that have a carbon to nitrogen ratio on the order of 30-to-1. And that might go up to 70-to-1 for like the 2-inch end. And when you're talking about bigger wood, like it goes as high as 700-to-1. So with that bigger wood, you have a definite like tying up of nitrogen because you put down so much carbon. With the smaller wood, you don't have that issue to the same extent, but it also depends on how you're putting it down. So if you went into a bare earth scenario or a grass, whatever scenario, and laid down that first layer of wood chips and you put it down 6 to 8 inches thick to smother whatever plants were there, and you did a complete job of it, you might have some months where there will be a nitrogen tie-up. So you might compensate for that by putting down some soybean meal or some other nitrogen source mixed in with the chips at the bottom layer. On the other hand, if you're coming in and you're adding to a layer that already exists, the soil mulch interface has already balanced that out a little bit more. So again, one of the fun things of this is any question you ask me, there's this nuance to it. And then we have to define that and think about how that works. So yes, you can put down fresh chips. If you have very young trees, I take that yes back, because if you're using coniferous chips, no, because it has to go through this different breakdown phase. And depending how thick you put it. So what I do, typically, I have about 400 some trees, primarily apple, and wood chips get dumped in a pile on the end of our driveway, and I have a tractor, and I will go dump a pile on this I might say it's the year of the north side of the tree, but it's not that rigid. You'll get the idea. And I'll dump it there. And then the next year, provided I have enough chips, I'll do it on another side of the tree. So I'm also creating a dynamic through haphazard mulching, where there's this woodsy material in different stages of decomposition, which in my mind is not unlike a salad bar. And the roots and mycorrhizal fungi and the sapotrophic fungi kind of get to choose whether they're going to feed and draw what they need to draw. So all that comes into my mind with that question.
Okay, Rob Bishop of Hoona has a question. He says that asks, the University of Washington came out with a study that willow ramial wood chips increase the immune response against apple scab. In your experience, have you experienced this, and why?
So I haven't experienced it, Rob, so much that I've done a comparison study of willow versus other materials. But what's being referred to here is that willow has a higher salicylic acid aspect among its constituents. This is why you can chew on a willow twig if you have a headache. Salicylic acid, we synthesize that to make Bayer aspirin. And salicylic acid is very much involved in one of the defense pathways, that phytochemistry I was referring to, that the plant uses to ward off disease organisms. So if willow chips, and if researchers are saying this, are showing an increase in defense mechanisms, and particularly related to willow, my mind would kind of be on that, okay, it's got some of the good stuff that's either being utilized directly by the tree, or it's reminding the tree, let's produce more of this, so we're in a position to thwart the disease organism.
I have a wonderful question from Tracy, and it gives you a sense of the Alaska experience here. It says, would bear scat or chicken manure mixed with clay also work well for the topical slurry?
So chicken manure might be a bit super rich. I wouldn't necessarily rule out using some of that. Or if it was composted, I'd feel a little bit better about it. I mean, I have black bears. Never crossed my mind that and then they get in the orchard and there are these poop piles, so they're out there. But it never crossed my mind to utilize that. But it's going to have organisms that are probably positive. And sometimes I find the answers that lie within the ecosystem you're dealing with are maybe even better than my generalities. But I can't guarantee this one. That's what I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Rob Bishop, another question. Do you deal with tiger moth caterpillars? And if so, do you know of a pheromone trap to deal with these?
So tiger moth, I don't know tiger moth specifically. We have something out here called the leopard moth, which its larva becomes like it bores into branches and into trunks, not like a beetle borer at the base of the tree cutting off the cambium connection. It just makes a very big hole. I know that there's a pheromone for leopard moth. Is there for tiger moth? I don't know. That would depend on the extent of how much of a concern this is to make it a commercial venture to create that pheromone, but it can certainly be created because that's what we have figured out about moths, that they create this sexually attracting pheromone that the male smells to find the female. So they've been synthesized for dozens of species, but I have no idea about tiger moth. I'm going to add that to my list. What is the tiger moth?
Okay. Ed Byarski of Juneau. I would be concerned about the alder, willow, poplar tree roots competing with the fruit trees within a 50-foot radius, since all roots are in the top 12 inches of our shallow soil. And comment, please.
So your answer is keep them 50 feet away. If you got them closer and you're actively coppice managing those roots, I see root systems that are set back annually and thus not necessarily as persistent. But that's a very good practical question in terms of what's the right distance in the ecosystem you have to take advantage of bridging effect, but at the same time also recognize that when you, like, let's say the comfrey plant that I talked about, when people design a fruit guild in a permaculture class, they often put a comfrey plant like 1 foot away from the trunk. That sets back the growth. You have to be kind of practical minded, like root reach. You want the roots of willow and alder, what have you, to intertwine with the fruit tree roots. That's even probably better than having several different passage plants involved when you're 300 feet away. Maybe not better.
Okay,
but you have
I've
to
got
be
a.
practical.
I guess I'm concerned. So you're saying you do want roots of alders and the other deciduous trees near the apple trees or not? I mean, again, the competition is severe. I mean, I'm a landscaper. I don't recommend anybody planting anything other than blueberries within 20 to 50 feet of a spruce tree, say. And the cottonwoods, I mean, the roots spread, multiple feet per year. If you cut it, I mean, you cut down a cottonwood tree and 30 or 40 feet away, up comes new sprouts. That's severe competition.
And I'm respecting what you've experienced. I am saying, you're not ruling out that bridge tree effect if those trees, other species, are 100, 200 feet away necessarily. I mean, if there's a driveway in between and the root connection isn't quite as strong, maybe you are. We have popple here, and popple grows in the wood's edge. These trees get, I don't know, 60 feet tall or so, and they're definitely a root suckering tree that I'll see popple coming up 40, 50, 60 feet away from where the tree is actually in the woods. But in my orchard, between mowing and sawing, they never become trees. So those roots are there, and I just think of them as conduits of some of the mineral action of the other. But you have to, again, I want to emphasize practical experience and enough distance. So you're not necessarily ruling out this bridge tree effect in that orchard ecosystem, which is bigger than the canopy reach of your fruit trees. We know that the root reach goes further, typically twice again what we see growing above in terms of breadth, in terms of outreach. But just keep in mind, we're talking about a plant community effect. It's not so much willow and apple, it's willow and apple and other plants in between that can bridge, create this through the protoplasm of all the different plants, bringing together all these different fungal species, that benefit might have value. Does that make sense?
Does to me.
Yeah, it does. Like I said, just having seen everything getting choked out as our other native trees grow. I mean, short of putting in, literally, I put in root barriers. I mean, I put in, 30-inch deep root barriers to stop that. So to give the non-native fruit trees, ornamentals, whatever, a chance to grow with less competition. So that's, having any of that other stuff close by is going to lead to the detriment of everything but the native trees, especially if we're putting compost around our regular trees, and they will steal those nutrients as fast as you apply them.
No, and so that's a good practical observation of how that's working where you are on that very thin soil. So, I honor that. It's like we're talking kind of the principles of what could be. And what is a root barrier? Is that like sheet metal or something that you're putting down? Or?
Yep. Some of that, there's 30 mil and 40 mil plastic. It's sometimes sold, at least on the West Coast, as bamboo root barrier. And sometimes we have to do that. And I have, yes, recycled sheet metal also, just to stop my blackberries from taking over the world also. Same reason, same situation. Salmon
Yep, okay.
berries, thimbleberries, and others. Again, you can't plant them anywhere close to, or plant a raspberry patch or otherwise close to any of those, because the wild stuff will so far outcompete the non-natives.
Yep, that sounds sensible. And now maybe Rod Bishop's containers have a plus in that regard.
Definitely, yes.
There's many things to think about, and yeah, each region, each site has parameters that, you know, I'm not delivering the answers for everybody. I'm hoping to stimulate how to think about them. You brought in a great point. You know, I hear what you're saying.
I'm going to jump in here. Greg Meckles has asked, in an old orchard unsprayed for 40 years, with great biodiversity in the understory, our young tree plantings are having a hard time. Is there commonly an issue with young trees being planted into an old orchard? And what is the best way to prepare them for success in this setting? Thank you so much.
So in a active commercial orchard, and it could be an old orchard that goes back 80 years or so. And there was a time, I don't think this is going to be your Alaska setting. Maybe that was being managed with lead arsenic, going back to those days. And there is something called apple replant disease, and it's about soil organisms, the ones that are predominant. And, you know, cover cropping is one way you might change that organism profile. Specific cover cropping involving like using mustard as part of the cover crop mix is another way to draw in certain organisms and shift that. I don't know what specifically your young trees, what the struggle looks like. What Ed and I just talked about in terms of giving those root systems more space. I wonder if that's involved. But if it's about the organisms and shifting it, you know, the application of compost, a lot of times as people, we think that's about replenishing nutrients. The compost, if it's done right, is just as much, if not more, about reestablishing microorganism diversity. When I talked about the mycorrhizal root dip, there are definitely mycorrhizae in this old left alone orchard ecosystem. Some of them may be right, but you may be missing some players. It doesn't cost that much to use powder inoculum, put it in a sprinkling can and stir it and mix, pour that around the base of the tree, maybe even move aside an inch or two of duff mulch matter so that you get those spores down near the roots of that tree. You might introduce a player or two that are needed for that tree to thrive better. Similarly, if your neighbor's with Ed, you know, when he's in bed and you go in his fruit house and you take some of the soil where his trees are growing really good, I shouldn't be saying it this way, Ed, but I am. And you come back and you take a quart of that and you mix it around the roots of your tree. Usually I'm referring people not to Ed's planting, but to wild trees that look really healthy out in the ecosystem. That's another way to get some indigenous species. So my mind would be on too much competition from other roots, the way Ed described it. Because again, I'm not in your ecosystem. I don't know what that really looks like. And second, are the right array of microbes involved with those trees. And then I would be looking at soil tests and organic matter and also understanding some of the nutrient picture.
I would throw in a comment there, Michael. You know, in the conversation in your writing about cation balancing and the value of soil testing, it's kind of caught my interest. pH, availability of calcium, cation exchange, that kind of thing. Could you comment on that in relationship to that question?
So when we talk of cation balance, we're talking about positively charged calcium, magnesium, potassium. And on a, not all soil tests, but a lab that takes an Albrecht perspective, they will provide base saturation ratios. And ideally, calcium to magnesium is going to be on the order of 70-1. So you're going to see calcium at like 68, 70, 72%, and magnesium at 10, 12%. And you don't have to get locked in on rigidity here. If it's 5-1, that's still in the positive direction. And I have no idea if your typical soils are calcareous or magnesium is much higher. And then potassium piece, you're going to get that from the wood chips. You're going to get that from the compost. You might have plenty in your soil. When they're out of balance and potassium is excessive, magnesium is excessive, that can deter from calcium getting into the plant. And that's also a complicated picture. So when I heard just now in this question, the young trees aren't doing so well, I would need to hear a little bit more of what's not doing. Is it shoot growth really stunted? Are you seeing like, and I also don't know what's the Alaskan parameters on this, but on a non-bearing young tree, I like to see 18, 24 inches of growth. And this is a northern perspective. If I go down to Connecticut, Rhode Island, you're going to see more like 30, 36 inches on some trees. I don't want it to be rampant and out of control, but I definitely want to see that kind of approaching 2 feet of growth on that young tree. But once the tree comes into bearing, I'd like to see shoot growth more on the order of, let's say, 8, 10, 12 inches. I want the tree to be calm, putting its energy into fruiting. So I'd need to hear a little bit more about what these young trees are struggling with. But anyway, back to your question aspect there, Burl. When liming, it's not just about getting the pH up, it's about the right kind of lime. So dolomitic lime, higher in magnesium. If you need magnesium base saturation to go up, that's the choice of lime to use. If the calcium piece is looking pretty right, and one way to think about that is soil labs will often give you a number in parts per million for calcium. This is not the saturation rate percentage. But if you take a parts per million for calcium times 2, that gives you a pounds per acre equivalent. At a minimum, you want to be seeing 2,000 pounds per acre, but even better is 3,000 pounds per acre. And now let's hold on to that piece. If you have a heavy clay soil, a little extra calcium is helpful. So all those things kind of come into, if I was making recommendations based on a soil test, into my thinking of what I'd be talking about. Is that what's going on with these trees? I don't know, but that's a piece that would be, yes, you want to get that pH in the 6.2, you'll hear to as much as like 6.8. I mean, if you're in a very alkaline place, that's already a struggle. But if you're probably in an acidic place like I am, 6.2 is probably a better place for the fungi than 6.8. And if you're starting below there, you just don't need to pass that point. But yeah, that's a piece as well.
Thank you. Okay, Sally Piercy, what is the recommended timing and efficiency for your seasonal sprays in our temperate rainforest environment?
So, I explain in the books that the orchard calendar is not about April 15th or May 1st or June 6th. It's about bud stage development. So the fruit tree that we're talking about, whether it's peach or, well, not peach. I don't talk about peaches, you don't talk about peach. But if it's apple or a pear or the berries, there's a point where there's enough comes out of dormancy and it takes so much accumulated warmth of the sun for things to develop. And so, I'm not going to give you calendar answers. I'm going to give you bud stage answers. So when you look at the material posted at groworganicapples.com, the network website, or in my books, I'll refer to, for instance, spring tube spray. That's made it pink on apple. If you're growing sour cherries, they bloom ahead of apple, and they have like one bump ahead in the schedule. But all these events, and by events I mean codling moth egg hatch, apple scab, first release of spores, they're timed to the same construct of degree days, which is based on monitoring high and low temperatures when a certain threshold of development is reached. So in the case of apple, that threshold, when you're tracking apple scab, is the first smile of green tissue on a mid-season variety. And that spray schedule kind of just ties into bud development, what's going on in the orchard. And yeah, and like I said, spring sprays are made a little tighter together because there's more going on, and then you reach the cell division of fruitlets, which is going to impact fruit size and fruit quality. You want good cell division to be happening. I supply nutrients in that period. And then it starts to spread out more in the summer. And if it's a much drier summer, I'm less active in that respect than I am in a very wet summer when there's going to be more rot pressure.
Okay, Ed is a little concerned about root competition, another competitive concern that relates to comfrey. And
I think Michael answered that pretty well earlier. I typed that as he was starting on comfrey, and then he answered that about not, maybe not planting it too close and keeping it out of the way. I mean, once you have comfrey, you can never get rid of it. I mean, that's been my experience. That's all. So yeah, I don't need any more from that. Thanks.
But I'd like to give two quick bits.
Oh, go for it.
One is that the Cyphidum officinalis, the European comfrey that the medicine journals are based off of, that forms fertile seed, and that needs to be chopped so that you don't have all comfrey. So that's kind of an invasiveness from above. From below, so rather than the Cyphidum officinalis, you look for what are called the Bocking cultivars, Bocking. They don't set fertile seed. So those can be managed as a living mulch plant, the way I defined it. But the other thing about comfrey that's really nice, and it's different than the alder willow situation, is yes, big roots, long roots, don't necessarily go deep, but they go out. But there's a lot of room around them. It's not a dense, compact root system like sod. So there's a lot of room underneath this big leaf plant for fruit tree roots to share that space with comfrey roots. I mean, the comfrey roots are there and they're big, but there's space more so than there will be with certain other type plants. And, I actually like big leaf plants in that drip line role that I defined for comfrey. So if burdock pops up, or there's some ornamental crabs where we have rhubarb. Rhubarb's not a mycorrhizal plant, but it's so big leafed in the canopy, just there's a lot of space, even though this plant seems to be occupying all the above ground. Down below, there's more room in the humus for sharing that space.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
Do you think that's true? Even because I've got comfrey under a handful of trees, and it's gotten pretty dense, and it's about maybe 3 feet from the trunk. And do you think that's still the case? And I've also wondered if it's inside the drip line, does that reduce the competitive issue?
So for me, part of that conversation is going to be, as I get into my trunks more, I prune for openness, but there's less sunshine in the heart of that space under the canopy. So I don't see quite the same vigor. Now I have some comfrey that has creeped inward a little bit. These Bocking cultivars, if you plant a root piece and get it started, are not as aggressive as you think. But on the other hand, if you planted comfrey and then you went and dug to get more root pieces to move elsewhere, where you've harvested roots, whether for medicine use or to spread plants, there will be a much more dramatic root comeback in terms of taking more of that space. And then the other thing that occurs to me is, if it's getting too close to your trunk and you're seeing some kind of competitive aspect, throw some cardboard sheet mulching. I know that's not going to, as Ed said, comfrey lives forever once you make this commitment. But it's not going to let the plant thrive. Or if what you're seeing is happening, it's getting too close, and you come through and sigh it 3 or 4 or 5 times, that plant doesn't get the sunshine to quite do as much, be so aggressive in terms of root development, taking up the space. So yes, it's an assertive plant, and there is some management that we're capable of, but we can also, I think, calm down that situation. So I have not been overwhelmed by it here in Zone 4, Northern New Hampshire.
Question, do you have any tricks around managing slug populations?
In the garden, we have some slug issues sometimes. So I have not dealt with them in terms of fruit. I'll see little snails on some of my apples, but it's not overwhelming. I'm picturing you're in the like rainforest area of Alaska asking this. So no, I've not heard that solution yet. I'm all ears if someone knows.
Okay. Rob Bishop comments about his trees, which are indoors in pots. And Rob's had a pretty interesting program previously here about his indoor growing. We manage our potted trees with mulching with dead leaves and seaweed on top while making sure the mycorrhizae and the worms are allowed living space year round. We use a fabric, quote, air pot for the container of these indoor fruit trees. That's kind of just a comment. Whitney Rapp, I got your question here. And just like garden worms, which gardeners love, but our native ecosystems have suffered as they weren't adapted to them. I'm curious if we know anything about the risks of introducing mycorrhizal fungi. Many of the species are not likely native to Alaska.
Okay, that is a good question. So in truth, there's probably more native to Alaska than you think. And so let's just start with the fact that starting 400 million years ago, oceanic fungi worked out this thing with the algae, which were the ancestors of vascular plants, to be a surrogate root system for that plant. And over the course of time, the endomycorrhizae reproduce asexually. So there's not like tens and tens of thousands of new species. There's basically about 400 species of endomycorrhizae. And when you introduce, if you utilize a commercial inoculum product and it has the 9 different strains, these are strains that have been selected because they've been found in numerous ecosystems, from the rainforest to the boreal environment. So everything in between, the savanna, the temperate forest, what have you, the grasslands. And there are species that have traits that are pretty much needed by a wide array of plants. So one of them is a Dlamis massae, which is very adept at moving water. So if there's a dry portion of the orchard ecosystem, that's one of the fungi, and like making sure some water gets over to that part of the orchard. And these skill sets are very inherent in the specific species genetics, but a Dlamis massae that was, let's say, in a Southwest desert environment might actually gain an attribute, not shift its genetics, that when introduced through inoculum in another ecosystem will meet up with the massae that's growing there. And because of the same species, they're hyphae confused, and that skill set can be passed along. So we're dealing with a complex fungal intelligence of which we know some of the pieces. And I totally admire that question about, let's not introduce something dangerous here. But in all likelihood, if you were to do a mycorrhizal census of your ground, you're going to see several, if not more, of the species that are the common ones in inoculum are there. And the ones that aren't there, probably the ones in the inoculum are not going to thrive and take it over, because this whole partnership depends on the plant partners and who's needed, who responds to that, and it settles. So I think sometimes that the more important question is enough fungal diversity represented in an ecosystem than the fear of introducing some bad actor who suddenly takes over everything and just kicks all the indigenous species out. I mean, again, I honor that question, but I think when you start to learn about these fungal dynamics, but I've also presented to you that other piece. I call it Ent soil, the Ents, the tree shepherds in the Lord of the Rings. So yes, I'm a Lord of the Rings fan. Ent soil is going to that healthy, wild ecosystem, asking permission of the nature spirits, or however you go about this, and taking some soil from where roots have grown. And there's going to be spores and hyphal fragments in that soil that you bring back to your ecosystem. And this is hit or miss. You don't know the names of the species, but you might introduce that one or two more players that are really needed there to make the common mycorrhizal network more complete, more full.
Okay, with this is a question from Donna Ray. With the mulching below your fruit trees, one can attract more mice, rodents, and perhaps rabbits. What do you do regarding caging of fruit tree trunks, Michael? And we use hardware cloth and shelted plastic guards, which are open to other, but we're open to other ideas. Also an equipment question. Do you have a favorite gas-powered foliar sprayer? Great talk. Thank you.
So I haven't used the hardware cloth, the metal hardware cloth so much, because part of my trunk protection, so I use a plastic mesh with little button snaps. Part of my trunk, and with the hardware cloth, you sometimes get cut more readily. Part of my trunk protection scenario is we have something called round-headed apple tree borer, and he who must not be named almost. And I have to get into my trunks, and I do neem sprays, and I've learned how to manage that a whole lot better, but I don't want to do any kind of permanent bowl guard setting. And so working with metal has never been quite as readily to take off, so I can get in there to do that work. But yes, bowl guards are pretty essential, and with the more rigid plastic versions, as long as there is some aeration, that's important. You don't want to seal it in. That's where those trunk wraps, the spiral guards, were not always so good. And again, that's kind of a borer perspective as well. This is very dangerous, you know. When I talk about some of my scenarios or name my pests, like round-headed apple tree borer, you'll never have heard of it, and the next year you're all going to be talking about, this is the worst pest we've ever seen. It's like, it can be induced, I think. So yeah, so there we got the tree guard thing. Then the gas-powered sprayer. I have a tractor, so I'm using a Rears pack tank off my 3-point hitch, and then my few backpack sprayers are hand pump. So I have not had direct experience of a gas-powered. I know some friends who have a Solo. They've seemed happy, but I actually don't have I don't know the whole range to be able to narrow it down and say this is the one.
Okay, let's see. We're winding down here. Mary Jane has asked, can anyone offer some good brands of twig branch chippers? Thank you. So we're asking about a chipper, and I guess the question is, what is the scale of chipping? And we're, Michael, you're talking about 2 to 2.5 inches is the diameter. So I assume somebody's chipper might want to gobble up a 3-inch stick if it had to.
So in my case, I have a Wallenstein chipper that operates, they're made in Canada, and it operates off the 3-point hitch of my tractor. And I really like it. It's really well made, and nothing complicated there. I know they make some models that would be their own gas engine and those smaller types. But but I think others are going to have the experience that I don't have with that size of chipper to give you the right answer. The Wallenstein with a W out of Canada makes a quality product.
Okay, Maine versus Alaska. Whitney has a comment that slugs and comfrey do much better here. Let's see. Okay, I got a Erica Merklin. No, what have I got here? I'm kind of bouncing along here. We're about to wrap it up here, folks. We're going to let Michael enjoy the rest of his afternoon here. Mary Jane, the Korean natural farming, which seems like permaculture practices to me, has recipes for solutions that can be used as sprays that use indigenous microorganisms. I will add that, yeah, I think it's a little bit beyond the focus here with this program, the digging down and drilling down on the natural foliar sprays, which are covered well in Michael's books. But let's just talk about that question, the permaculture practices and the Korean natural farming and their use of indigenous microorganisms and sprays. Anything about that?
So typically the Korean natural farming approach is about putting, I'm being oversimplistic, putting rice in a box and putting it out in the litter duff of the forest and building up a first generation of lactobacilli species. And you may get some Bacillus subtilis and some of the other soil organisms involved there, but it's primarily the lactobacilli piece. And then there's different concentrations of that you continue to feed and build and then apply that. And there could be certainly dozens more different organisms. I'm naming a primary player. So when I talked about effective microorganisms, I am buying a mother culture and activating. Now, at the same hand, I'm actually really excited about this new idea, which I just started experimenting with last season. And that is when you make cider, hard cider, you ferment the juice of the apple. You, one of the things that results, then the yeast take the sugars and make alcohol. And then it all settles, and then you bottle the cider off of lees in the bottom of the carboy or the barrel, whatever your fermenting tank vessel is. Those lees are rich in yeast and lactobacilli. So I've been playing with taking the lees and feeding them blackstrap molasses. And that is definitely being consumed. And I know that the pH drops, it's working just like activating effective microorganisms. So what's exciting here is I'm kind of creating an apple grower's version of indigenous microbes and utilizing the yeasts that were on my fruit that came in with the fruit harvest and are in the cider and fermented the juice. And now I'm using those populations to restore what I need out in the orchard. So there's many takes on this. You know, some of you are maybe really excited and practiced at making compost tea, and that's a much quicker variation on getting lots of microbes into a contained space that you can apply. But I think they're all good directions. And so if you're excited about some of these Korean natural farming approaches, you know, that's definitely, you should be trying that. And this is how we're all learning together. But there are somewhat definitions of what we're doing. When I talked about this fermented plant extracts, microbes are involved, but my focus then is really on let's get nutrients into the solution. With compost tea, kind of the far side of this, it's all about feeding enough fungi and bacteria to populate every square inch or whatever, every liter, every microliter in that volume of liquid. So we have organisms going out ready to hit the ground running. So again, different things, different processes, but you're tuning into the microbes, you're tuning into biology. That tells me you're tuning into the right direction.
I'm going to make one more question available. It's very relevant to where we're at right now. It's from Erica Merklin here up in the upper Chilkat Valley. Have you utilized any fermented recipes from Dr. Cho of the Korean Natural Farming program for different stages of plant growth and growing local indigenous microorganisms? for introduction to the orchard or garden. And that's going to be it for our questions, folks. We promised Michael he could get on his way after 2 hours, and we've hit that point. So yeah.
So my answer is I have not particularly done some of those herbal tinctures that you might read about in Korean natural farming. One of my consultant clients is really attracted to it, so we're setting up some trials. He did a first year last year with young trees utilizing this. I talked to vegetable market gardeners like Brian O'Hara, who has a book with Chelsea Green on no-till market gardening that gives you a lot of information about that, and he's really hepped up on that. So I have a pulse on it, but it has not been my specific practice. On the other hand, I'm utilizing herbs, and the energetics of all these different things comes into play here as well. It's a good time in the sense of understanding trees and moving ahead on the biological front to be doing this, because we can share. We can, today we did what we call a Zoom conference. I would call it kind of like a mycelium get together. We connected New Hampshire and Alaska, and by sharing these thoughts, sharing these ideas, we're all thinking, and we're going to move forward into a new growing season, and it's going to be exciting and it's going to be good.
Michael, thank you very much for your program today. We've really benefited from this, and we will have another program on April 3rd that is specifically about fungal duff management.